This is a special production of ABC News. This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ed Koppel.
Good evening. If you've been anywhere near a television set or a radio these past few hours, you already know that John Lennon of the Beatles is dead. He was shot late this evening in front of his apartment building in New York City. Apparently, he was killed almost immediately. The man who shot John Lennon walked up to the musician as he was leaving his limousine. According to eyewitnesses, he said, "Mr. Lennon," and then fired at him point blank at least 5 times. Standing by now in New York with more details is ABC's Lynn Scher.
John Lennon was murdered on his way home, just outside the celebrated Manhattan apartment house, the Dakota, where he lived with his wife, Yoko Ono, and a 5-year-old son. Apparently, he stepped out of the limousine and headed through the gates towards the vestibule when a man emerged and fired 7 times. According to police sources, the man had been seen at the apartment house earlier, and later in the evening when Lennon arrived, the man appeared to be rational. He called out Lennon's name, then crouched police-style and fired.
The 4 cops pulled John Lennon out and put him into the back of a police car, and he was bleeding from his mouth, and it was a terrible sight.
John Lennon's body was immediately rushed in a police car here to Roosevelt Hospital, just 13 blocks away from his apartment in Upper Manhattan. He was dead on arrival. They tried resuscitation and they tried transfusions, but nothing worked.
How many times?
He had multiple gunshot wounds in his chest, in his left arm, and in his back.
How many shots are we talking about?
There were 7 wounds in his body.
7
Yes.
bullets?
I don't know exactly how many bullets there were. There were 7 wounds.
How extensive was the damage, Sergeant?
There was a significant injury of the major vessels inside the chest, which caused a massive amount of blood loss, which probably resulted in his death.
Did he lose consciousness right away, do you
Dr.
think?
Lynn also
I'm
said
certain
that as
that
far
he
as he
was
could
dead
tell,
at the
Lennon
moment
died
that
with the first shot.
shots hit his
But
body.
that didn't stop a number of Lennon's fans from gathering at the hospital and at his apartment house to pray and to remember. Lynn Scher, ABC News, New York.
John Lennon was shot at a well-known New York apartment building, the Dakota House on West 72nd Street, and ABC's Rita Sands is standing by live at the Dakota now. Rita, what have you been able to learn since the shooting? Rita Sands, can you hear me?
Go, you're on.
Rita?
Ted, what we know about the suspect at this time is, first of all, his identity, 25-year-old Mark David Chapman. He comes from Hawaii. Police tell me he's been in the New York area about a week and began to hang around the Dakota apartment over the weekend asking about John Lennon. He apparently ran into him for the first time this evening about 5 o'clock, asking Lennon for his autograph. Lennon gave it to him on the jacket cover of a record. Lennon went off to a recording session, and we are told that Chapman remained at the hotel until Mr. Lennon returned about 11 o'clock this evening. Police officials describe what happened this way. They say that Chapman came up from behind, yelled out Mr. Lennon's name, and emptied a .38 revolver. There were at least 5 shots spent. There were 7 gunshot wounds, 3 considering both entrance and exit wounds. The worst damage came from the chest wounds. Lennon shouted that, "I know I've been shot." He stumbled up several steps into the Dakota and collapsed inside in an office area and was taken immediately to Roosevelt Hospital, where we are told he was dead on arrival. There is very little known about 25-year-old Chapman, only that he's been staying at a local Y for several days and then at another hotel in the last day or two. He has been taken to the 20th Police Precinct, fingerprinted. They're checking for prior arrest records. Also, for any motive, they don't have any yet. They've charged him officially with murder, but the reason for this attack, unknown. Ted?
Thank you, Rita Sands. Correspondent Geraldo Rivera, who covered John Lennon's career as an artist and a personality for many years, has filed this report now on John Lennon's life and his music.
John Lennon, without a doubt, was one of the most important musicians of our time. A man of unlimited energy and talent, he was a force that overlapped the world of rock and roll and affected the attitudes and style of a whole generation of people. He, along with Paul McCartney, were the real cornerstones of the Beatles, the creators of an evolution in rock music. They were the heirs to Elvis Presley and the forerunners of everything that's followed, whether it's punk music or the mellow sound of rock and roll. Now, in the music business, it's very, very unusual for any group or any single individual to command the public's attention for more than just a little while. It's testimony to the greatness of the Beatles and to the four fellows who made up the group that fully 11 years after their last album, they still command the respect, the attention, and the airplay from the music professionals and from the people who love rock and roll. John and Paul wrote most of the 250 million records the Beatles sold and continue to sell. Great music from perhaps the most important ensemble in recent music history. During the early 70s, the Beatles, like the country, went through incredible individual changes. John and Paul had both decided to go it on their own. The decision, which was based on real personal as well as the professional considerations, shocked millions of us. How could it happen to the Beatles? Everyone should relax, was the general feeling. The Beatles are just too important. They have to be back. But the public, all of us, were underestimating their resolve. Just as they had captured and commanded a fantastic audience with the group, now they wanted to do the same thing. In the words of John Lennon, they wanted to do it in their own right. John and his then new wife Yoko really took the heat for the decision. How could they? How could she? How could John Lennon leave the Beatles for Yoko Ono? Again, we underestimated him, we underestimated them. He loved her, and he loved his newly found independence. And despite problems with acceptance, rejection, and even a bizarre attempt by the Immigration and Naturalization Service to deport him because of an obscure arrest in London for marijuana in 1968, John and Yoko prevailed. They went back to work in the early 70s, John and Yoko did. But then they went into seclusion, during which time John lived the melancholy life of a man who temporarily, at least, was going through a personality crisis. For a time, he found himself right in the middle of rock and roll's fast lane. But they got through it, and John was starting over. He had a new record album recorded just 2 months ago. It was a good album that was receiving general public acceptance. John Lennon was back, until an assassin ended the life of this fantastic talent. A man who changed the history of rock and roll. I'm gonna decide. I think it's the day. The girl that's driving me mad is going away. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride.
Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday.
Perhaps the most tragic aspect of what's happened is that John Lennon was back. He was performing. He got the energy back. He had made an album. He is just about completing a second album. And this random act by this assassin has ended what was to be a second coming of John Lennon.